My name's Andy Gustafson, and this semester we've been having a number of Business Faith and Common Good speaker series, speakers coming in. And for today, we teamed up with IEI because they do the food for thought. So we've got a lot of people here, and I'm glad that you're all here. I think you'll find this talk very interesting. I just met Adam this summer, and it's a testimony to the value of going to different conferences. I went to a conference this summer in Denver, happened to meet him during the cocktail hour, really enjoyed some of the things he was talking about with his research, finding out about private enterprise in Maoist China, and I thought, let's bring that guy to Creighton because I think the students would really find that interesting. And evidently you do, or else you're just here for a QR code, one of the two. But either way, I'm glad you're here. I think you'll find the work that he does very interesting. I would like us all to give him a round of applause because just yesterday, he graduated, or he didn't graduate, but he successfully defended his dissertation defense at Harvard. So let's give him a round of applause. Adam and his wife are moving to Amsterdam in a week or
Denmark.
two. Sorry. Denmark to Copenhagen, not to Amsterdam. And they'll be moving there, and he's going to start teaching in the spring, and so is she. So they're really in a lot of transition, but in the meantime, he flew here from California to come to Omaha. He's going back to California, then he's going to Boston, and then he's going to Copenhagen. So thank you so much for taking time to be with us, and we're glad to have you here. Looking forward to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. And there's still some students back there. There's a little bit of space over here.
Space over here if you want to come in and sit on the floor. I'm going to sit on the floor right here. Or you can stand back there.
So I can take it away?
Take it away. Oh wait, I was supposed to talk about this one.
Okay.
This is the PPE reading group, and you're all welcome to join that for next spring. It's put on by IEI, so you just have to apply. It's very easy. Anything else you want to say about Raphael?
Just apply for the QR code.
Okay, apply to the QR code, and you can find it on the website.
For November 28th.
Starts November 28th.
Before.
Oh, okay. Well, apply before November 28th. So apply before you go home for Thanksgiving. All right. That's it.
Yep. So I'm Adam K. Frost from Harvard University, and I work on the history of entrepreneurship in contemporary China. And I focus mostly on illicit entrepreneurship, underground capitalism, and things of that nature, particularly during China's socialist era. So let me begin, before I go into the talk and everything, I just want to tell you a story because I think it really illustrates the kind of things that I'm interested in. So about 2 hours drive north of Shanghai, in the middle of the rural countryside where there's fields covering, rice paddies covering the fields like fish scales, there's this 70-story luxury hotel that, looms above everything else. And atop it is this golden sphere, as you can see. Looks like the eye of Sauron looking over the surrounding countryscape. And inside the sphere is a revolving restaurant staffed exclusively by North Korean waitresses. And in that restaurant, you can sit and get this panoramic view of the surrounding countryside while you're eating fresh sashimi and drinking French wine and eating Kobe beef. And you get to look around at the farms and the factories of this village. Now, 10 floors down from that restaurant is this gold-themed lounge. Everything is gilded in gold. And then in the middle of that lounge is a 1 metric ton solid gold bull. And that thing's worth like $80 million or something to that effect. And this cathedral of conspicuous wealth, it was constructed in celebration of the 50th anniversary of Huaxi Village, the wealthiest village in China. So Huaxi is famous in China. It's the archetype of what they call the Sunan model of development. It's supposedly the best example of how socialist collective development can lead to long-term economic prosperity. So after reform and opening up in China in 1978, this village decided to remain a collective, and it collectively owned all of its enterprises. They are all held by this thing called the Village Corporation. and everybody has a share in that. Now, according to the story that is taught to every child in Huaxi, the village's rise had everything to do with the so-called indomitable Huaxi spirit and the singular vision of the village chief, Wu Renbao. You can see him here. So when the village was formed in 1961, it was a poor community of farmers who lived in mud brick homes and farmed tiny parcels of land. But supposedly, under the leadership of this man, Wu Renbao, the party secretary, the villagers worked together to dig irrigation networks and manually transform the physiographic landscape, and thereby making it more amenable to agriculture. And the story goes that with more productive lands, the village began accumulating agricultural surplus, which it saved and reinvested in community enterprises. And after reform and opening up, again, the village voluntarily retained its collective structure and poured the whole of the community's wealth into the creation of new industrial enterprises. And over time, the so-called village corporation that managed these firms grew fabulously wealthy and distributed its earnings among the local villagers. So after visiting Huaxi for the first time, I became really interested in this history and the kind of truth of the its economic rise. And with the help of some acquaintances, I was able to connect with a few of the most elderly villagers there who lived through this entire period of transformation. And based on the interviews with those individuals, I began to uncover this alternative and I think more compelling explanation for Huaxi's rise. So according to these individuals, during the socialist era, during the Cultural Revolution, the height of anti-capitalist sentiments in China, Huaxi was actually an epicenter of illicit economic activity. And in the wake of the Great Leap Forward, which some of you may have heard of, I mean, it resulted in the largest famine in human history, claimed more lives than any other famine. This village they launched underground enterprises. They started a waste textile station that recycled tattered clothing into new cloth, which they then resold on black markets. By the start of the Cultural Revolution in 1966, Huaxi had already accumulated enough capital from this enterprise to purchase an industrial lathe, a punch press, and other metalworking tools. And I was told in another random interview that I got that it was actually the Navy that supplied these. There was naval officers who acquired this heavy machinery and illicitly sold it to Huaxi and other villages in the area. And they helped them basically outfit their illicit factories. And then the village hired so-called Sunday engineers. They were people that worked in state-owned factories, technicians and things, who would come on their days off to help set up the illicit underground enterprises in the countryside. And with all of this technology and skills, Huaxi was able to establish these underground factories that began producing things like high-quality all bits and threading dyes, which they then sold to state-owned enterprises throughout China. By the time that Deng Xiaoping called for reform and opening up in 1978, Huaxi had already accumulated capital, knowledge, and network connections and was well poised to take off. So as I learned more about this untold story of Huaxi, I began to wonder if what was true of the village might be true of other parts of China, or China as a whole. And I began to wonder whether other examples of socialistic, local economies that were also deeply capitalistic in nature, even during this period of high socialism. So my research that resulted from this, kind of early findings has really been motivated by what I understand is the central puzzle of Chinese economic development. Namely, how is it that China, a nation that for 3 decades attempted to enforce socialist institutions and suppress capitalist activity, was able to so quickly transform its economy into this engine of dynamic and sustained growth? Now, the prevailing view among social scientists is that prior to reform and opening up in 1978, China's economy was atomized, autarkic, and largely void of any private entrepreneurial activity. And they argue that socialist institutions divided society into self-reliant administrative units and totally squeezed out the market. And thus, brought economic life more fully under state control. But here's the problem. If the socialist economy were truly atomized and void of entrepreneurial activity, whence came China's entrepreneurial impulse? How did it take off so quickly after reform and opening up began? And why did China succeed in making its post-socialist transition, whereas so many other societies struggled to accomplish the same? So in today's talk, I'm going to provide a somewhat revisionist account of socialist entrepreneurship that pushes back the timeline of China's transformation by at least 2 decades. And I'm going to use unconventional historical sources and novel data to demonstrate that, first of all, people continued engaging in private entrepreneurial pursuits long after the socialist transformation was completed in the 1950s. I'll also argue that private entrepreneurial activity was far greater in scale and scope than previous scholarship would lead us to believe, and that local governments eventually began tacitly supporting entrepreneurs by refusing to enforce central policies at the local level. So before I begin to unpack these claims, let me tell you why I think the literature as a whole has sort of gotten China, the story of Chinese development, wrong. So much of what we think we know about the Chinese economy is rooted in the analysis of high-level official statistics, things like GDP, right? These large official numbers. But official statistics are problematic sources in general, but very problematic sources for the Chinese, socialist China in particular. Scholars have shown that production statistics and population statistics became radically divorced from the realities that they were supposed to represent during this period. The institutional incentives to accurately report simply didn't exist. More fundamentally, though, state statistics during this period were explicitly designed as instruments for legitimizing state power. The statistical science and communism, they were these mutually legitimizing projects. We can see here in this quote, as the head of the Statistical Bureau in 1960 wrote, "Statistical work is a weapon of class struggle and political struggle. Statistics should not be a mere display of objective facts." This is how they're conceptualizing statistics. So for this reason, scholarship that relies solely on official statistics to try to understand economic development in this period, well, at best suffers from extreme biases, or at worst is simply reproducing political fictions. So to overcome this fundamental limitation, in my work I adopt a radically different, bottom-up approach. So I collect very low-level grassroots sources that were produced by the very bottom level of government administration. And I use them to build large data sets, and then I use these data sets to reveal patterns of entrepreneurial practice that were obscured by high-level official statistics. So to introduce these sources briefly and explain how I work with them, let me tell you another story. So one day, I was doing research in eastern China, and I visited a flea market much like this one. And while walking from stall to stall, and I'm rummaging through fake antiques and socialist memorabilia, I come across this stack of brown jacketed dossiers. And I pick up the folder on the top of the pile, and I begin to flip through the contents, and inside are dozens of government reports from the 1960s on black markets, underground factories, and other so-called spontaneous capitalist activities. So I got really excited, and I bought the documents, and this was one of the first collections that I bought. And I asked the vendor if he had more. And so he shared his information over WeChat and invited me back to his home in rural Anhui. The next week, I find myself inside of his apartment, and it is chock full from floor to ceiling, the entire apartment of historical documents that this guy has bought up over the past 40 years. So, for the next 5 years, I network with communities of document merchants, like this guy, from whom I procure more than 80,000 pages of local government reports, white papers, criminal cases, and other documentary ephemera that were created and discarded by the Chinese state. The majority are low-level archives, as I mentioned, that were earmarked for destruction originally, but instead made their way into private circulation. And as I later gathered through interviews, in the 1980s there was this massive purge of documentary detritus that had been accumulated over the decades of socialist rule in the 1980s. But because China suffered from paper shortages at that time, the archivists were instructed to hand over the decommissioned documents to paper pulpers, who would theoretically recycle them into paper. But somewhere in that chain of custody, from archivist to paper pulper, someone decides, these are probably worth more if I just sell them to merchants as is instead of recycling them into paper. So for 40 years now, these materials have been circulating in private networks, and some have ended up in my personal archive. So today I'm going to focus on one type of document, these cases of so-called speculation and profiteering that were investigated and prosecuted by local government agencies during this period of history. These cases focus on people like these men, who were arrested for engaging in various types of illicit production and exchange. In this case, they were selling ration certificates. The case files range from a dozen to several hundred pages in length. They include all kinds of things like self-confessions of so-called speculators and profiteers, interrogation transcripts, where they're being investigated by the cadres who are prosecuting them, and records of seized contraband that they take from these individuals. And you won't understand it, but that's a general idea of what they are. So in the remainder of this talk, I'll describe how, by engaging with this type of sources at different levels, we are offered a completely different window through which to view socialist entrepreneurial practice. So let me tell you about one of these cases to give you a sense of what they look like. So in May of 1966, at the very kind of beginning of the awakenings of the Cultural Revolution, a group of market administration officers burst into the home of this man, Chun Guoheng. They immediately arrest Chun, they seize his belongings, they freeze his bank account, and they shutter his place of business. Now you might be wondering what kind of counter-revolutionary act could have provoked such a powerful state response. Well, as it turns out, Mr. Chun's was a crime of fashion. According to investigative reports, this man was the ringleader of an underground network of clothing designers who were illicitly producing, transporting, and selling outlandish clothing patterns, such as these. And these clothing patterns were popular. Investigations reveal that they were circulating around more than 25 provinces, i.e. all of China, basically, and were in such great demand that even state-run shops began selling them illicitly to their customers. Now, over the next 10 years, Mr. Chun would be repeatedly arrested and prosecuted for an array of economic crimes, all of which were extensively documented in more than 600 pages of investigative reports and interrogation transcripts. However, rather than meekly submit to prosecution, Chun wrote more than a dozen letters of appeal to higher authorities. And in these letters, he argued that the real reason he had been prosecuted was because he had outcompeted state-run enterprises. He said things like this. He said, when designing clothes, one cannot create as one pleases, nor can one work while isolated from sources of information. One must unify the social habits and customs of the people with knowledge about the human form and modern style. He went on to say, I dive into the realities of life by visiting every clothing shop, by listening to the suggestions of customers, by learning what styles the masses desire, and exchanging experience with others in my trade. Here, Chun Guoheng is articulating an almost Hayekian understanding of knowledge and its relationship to market processes. By engaging in knowledge discovery, Chun argues, an entrepreneurial individual can develop intimacy with their consumers and thereby come to understand their needs and desires. And we see evidence of this discovery process in Chun's products. So here are 9 variations on a design for long-sleeve shirts for the laboring masses. We notice that the shirts are supremely practical for wearing to work, They have large pockets and high collars. But the patterns also offer consumer a variety of stylistic choices. The designs are also situated in scenes of everyday life. The figure at the top right is spooning out slop to her pigs, while the figure at the bottom looks back over her flock of sheep. Yet both of these laboring women are fashionable. The young shepherd is standing in a pose that not only accentuates her short-sleeved shirt, but also shows how it can be paired with short-cuff trousers and heeled loafers. And it's these design elements, based on knowledge of consumer desire and an understanding of lived context, that made Chun's patterns so popular. So Mr. Chun's case is just one of about 6,000 that I've collected from flea markets across China. And while its focus on fashion makes it somewhat unique for this period, it's also emblematic of more universal forces that were reshaping the economy during this time. A deep reading of cases reveals that throughout the socialist era, citizens at all levels of society, from farmers to underground factory workers to the managers of state-owned enterprises, were creating productive assemblages of capital, labor, and knowledge. And they were circumventing formal institutions. So now we've seen how a close reading of cases can yield new insights into China's socialist economic practice. However, this method also faces limitations. If we only examine cases on an individual basis, it's difficult to speak to their generalizability or to situate them within broader patterns of practice. So in order to do this, we need to zoom out to a level where many of these cases can be simultaneously brought into view. And to explain how I've attempted this, let me return to the case files themselves. So most cases include some kind of summary page, like this at the beginning, that outlines the type of activities, where and when they occurred, and what goods were involved. As we can see in this example, the case involves a man in his 50s who illegally sells 6 head of cattle and thereby generates over 1,000 RMB in revenue. For this crime, the man was punished with a fine of 500 RMB. And although it's not featured in this particular example, many cases will also include information about the origin and the terminus of illicit economic activity. Where did he buy the cows? Where did he sell them? So on and so forth. So we can code all of these pieces of information into data. Now, in the course of procuring these documents, I was fortunate enough to come across 2 exceptionally complete collections of cases prosecuted in 2 local administrations in eastern China. You have Zhenjiang in the north, which is sort of near the city of Nanjing, and you have Chuan in the south, which is under Hangzhou. In total, I collected about 2,700 cases just from these 2 places. And over the course of 2 years, 2 long, grueling, miserable years, I digitized these documents and manually encoded their contents into what I believe is the largest data set on illicit economic activity for this period in Chinese history. So while I don't have time to go into detail about the process of coding the data and imputing the many missing values that happen in every historical data set, I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A if anyone's interested. But this data, this unique longitudinal data, enables us for the first time to begin to explore more general trends of illicit entrepreneurial activity and patterns of prosecution of said activity in this period of Chinese history. So what exactly does the data tell us? Well, first, the data set reveals something about the scale and the scope of illicit economic activities. So if we look at the statistics for the 2 counties that I just mentioned in my data set, we find that the mean value of goods included in each case is on the order of 300 to 500 RMB. Moreover, the mean amount of cash seeds exceeded 100 RMB. So these are pretty huge numbers. To put these figures into perspective, the mean annual consumption of a rural worker during this period was about 100 RMB. And the annual disposable income was much, much lower, around 10 to 20 RMB per year. Moreover, if we map out the spatial distribution of networks extending from each of the 2 counties in the data set, we find that illicit economic activities did not just occur within small spaces, within socialist administrative units, but rather across them. Indeed, in both cases, the network connections transition smoothly into the adjacent prefectures and provinces, and are largely unconstrained by administrative boundaries. In other words, taken all together, this data suggests that the mean individual being described in these cases, it's not a farmer selling some chickens at a local market. Rather, it's a specialized entrepreneurial actor who is distributing and potentially producing also goods across large spaces whose value represented years of consumption for the mean worker. If we further divide the cases into temporal cohorts, we notice two very surprising things. First, we see that only a handful of prosecuted individuals received any form of extra monetary punishment. In other words, when people were caught during this period engaged in illicit economic activities, they were usually just fined and released. Very few people are actually being sent to labor camps or in prison, which is what most people would assume about the period. Second, even when individuals were being fined or having their goods seized, the majority of things are still being returned to them. And this is very surprising because the central government policies state very clearly anyone who is caught engaged in these illicit capitalist activities is supposed to have all their things seized in the course of this. But the local officials apparently weren't doing this. In other words, based on this evidence, it seems that the local cadres on the ground were not faithfully executing the central policies. If we dig one level deeper into the data, we find more evidence of this. Here's a basic regression. It reveals that seizures and fines were inversely correlated with the total value of an illicit economic activity. In other words, the bigger the crime, the lighter the punishment. And this was true in both of the administrations I observed. And again, this directly contradicts state policies, which said that the severity of punishment was supposed to scale with the severity of the crime. The data therefore indicates that while officials may have voiced support of central government policies and performed to them, in practice, they were engaging in forbearance. They were not enforcing the central policies to the full extent of the regulatory stipulations at the local level. Now, at this point, I think it's fair to step back and ask, can this data be generalized, though? Does it apply to the whole of China? Because the two administrations that I just talked about are from eastern China. They're from a relatively wealthy area, and it's a traditional center of entrepreneurship and enterprise in China. So it might be that it's only happening here and nowhere else in China. So they definitely represent a biased sample. To understand whether or not we see similar things at the national level, I'll introduce one final complementary data set. So over the course of a half a year or so, I combed through more than 300 local gazetteers. These are documents that are produced by local governments that tell all about the goings-on in that particular place in history. And I grabbed a lot of data from them, and especially the number of cases of speculation and profiteering that were prosecuted within those administrations during this period of time. And using a bottom-up imputation process, I was able to then impute the total number of cases that were prosecuted at the provincial and the national level for the entire period. So in other words, again, it's not trusting the top-level official statistics accounts, but instead building up the data from the very smallest sources and then estimating the total. And I illustrate the resultant data in this figure, which shows national prosecutions by year as represented by the blue line. As we can see, there's a bimodal distribution of prosecuted cases. There's this big initial wave of prosecutions in the early 1960s, and then prosecutions fall off right after the start of the Cultural Revolution in 1966. And then they start to pick up again around 1971. In other words, just as anti-capitalist sentiments are cresting in China during the Cultural Revolution, and the central government's calling for the absolute and total suppression of private entrepreneurial activity, the actual prosecutions are entering a nadir. To show this more clearly, I also include here Andrew Walder's data on the deaths by political violence during this period, which is represented by the teal line. And as we can see, the two are almost perfectly obverse trends. Just as the deaths by political violence begin to rocket, actual prosecution of illicit economic activity drops precipitously. So this goes completely against our conventional understanding of this period of Chinese history. But I think there's a straightforward explanation. And I show this in my other work. It's that the chaos unleashed by the Cultural Revolution crippled the very institutions that were designed to suppress private entrepreneurial activity. The bureaucracy itself comes under attack during this period. All the top officials are kicked out, and they effectively, the government agencies effectively suspend their operations. And indeed, in my dissertation and other places, I use internal state reports to confirm that this was in fact the case. This weakening of institutional control, combined with the increasing reluctance of local officials to enforce central directives, I think offers a new and more probable explanation of the causes of the reemergence of entrepreneurship in China than the typical explanation of entrepreneurship just spontaneously popped up after reform and opening up. So to conclude, my work offers, I think, an important corrective to a literature that has overwhelmingly emphasized the top-down influence of the Chinese state. It shows that the entrepreneurial boom of the 1980s was not a response to top-down state reforms, but in fact it was a culmination of a bottom-up transformation that was already decades in the making. Through the building of these novel historical data sets, I show how even during the height of socialist control, the foundations for China's subsequent economic transformation were already being laid at the grassroots level by entrepreneurial individuals and entrepreneurial local officials. And I go on, in my dissertation at least, to argue that it's precisely this bottom-up character of change and the fact that local officials took the side of entrepreneurs against the central government that enabled China to achieve more dynamic and sustained growth than was experienced in, say, the USSR after it broke up and engaged in state-led reforms. And finally and briefly, I'll point out that this bottom-up approach has special significance for the study of entrepreneurship and economic development in non-capitalist contexts. It shows how we can build macroeconomic arguments through a very micro-historical orientation, one that differs pretty substantially from pure plyometric quantitative analysis in its treatment of historical sources and usage of data. It also shows how historians can play a productive role, not only as the critical consumers of archives, but as the curators and creators of data. So, thank you very much.
Any questions for Adam?
Sure.
So for one, I had a question. So for one, I'm understanding it is that capitalism never really went away in like communist China. Was that the same deal for Soviet Russia, or did they and versus how did the Russian government deal with it versus the Chinese-led government?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not an expert on the USSR, but I think what we see is that across these socialist contexts, say Cuba, the USSR, and other places, North Korea as well, we see robust black market activity in all of these contexts. So the argument that, now whether or not we call that capitalism is a different question, but it certainly is market-oriented, decentralized, privately initiated activity.
Okay.
Now what made China different though, I think, was how it handled this activity during the period. So the Soviet Union had all kinds of black markets and things too, But what made China special, in my opinion, is that over the course of the socialist era, the local officials increasingly start to take the side of the entrepreneurs at the grassroots level, and they shelter them from prosecution. They choose what to prosecute, what not to prosecute. I have more slides on that if you want to see it. But basically, some types of activities they crack down on hard if they thought it was unproductive in the local economy. For example, the exchange of ration certificates. This annoyed them because it just made it difficult for them to coordinate resources in local society. But if someone instead, say, launched an underground factory and started producing tools or machinery that were needed by local state-run collective enterprises, then they wouldn't crack down on it. Or they would crack down, or when they did punish it, they would punish it much more lightly. So I think this is a special character of Chinese entrepreneurship, this local buy-in of officials against the central government. And that eventually led to a more kind of bottom-up transformation than I think we see in many other post-socialist countries. Yeah?
Do we see a lot of like self-gaining opportunities for these local officials? Like if they seize half of all the goods, because how much of that is going from officials' pockets? Do you have evidence of that, or?
No, it's a great question.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah.
No, can Adam repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. So he's basically asking, how much evidence do we see of corruption of the local officials, engaging in bribery, pocketing the money, and things like that? So certainly there's a lot. There's a lot of it. I have an argument. So I think there's different types of corruption. And the kind of corruption is very important because some corruption is almost unambiguously bad. Right? If an official is embezzling funds from a collective enterprise and just putting it into his own pocket, I mean, that's pretty bad. I mean, we can say almost unambiguously that that's not playing a productive role in society. He's benefiting, other people are getting hurt. But in some cases, we have officials, as you said, as you suggested, taking a bribe to allow an underground factory to operate that's producing goods that are being bought by other actors in the local economy. Well, that's more difficult to say. Is it playing a productive or unproductive role in society? Then there's other cases still where local officials are themselves taking no gain, but they are simply sheltering private entrepreneurial activity. Now they're reaping no immediate gain, but this is also still being called corruption by the state because they're deviating from the standard institutional procedures and norms. And then there's other cases still where the officials are in on it. They're leading the underground enterprises and using their official status to shelter them and help them grow. Yes, there's a lot of evidence. It's almost impossible to say what extent this kind of corruption is playing out because it doesn't show up in the documents, right? I mean, by nature, this type of activity is not talked about. And the central government will, issue frustrated proclamations on it saying, oh, local officials are so corrupt, they're not following our practices, they're pocketing money, but it's really difficult to get a quantitative sense. But of course, that's true today, too. It's hard to say how much Congress accepts bribes or something like that. It's very difficult to document these things. But as I said, I think it's important to understand that there are different types of corruption, and that the different types of corruption have potentially different effects on long-term economic development. And I would argue that actually a lot of the things that are being called corruption during this period are playing highly productive roles in helping local economies develop. Where am I going?
So when people are getting caught, how are they getting caught? By secret police, or their friends are turning them in? Or?
Yeah, so a really fun part of my research was getting to hang out with a lot of former local government officials who used to be the guys prosecuting these illicit entrepreneurs. And so I had a lot of banquets, like everyone's smoking a ton and drinking lots of alcohol, and then it's amazing. Once you get enough alcohol in people, they will tell you all sorts of fun things about what they did in the past. So they said, according to their firsthand testimony, they said more than half of all of the cases that they prosecuted were being reported by citizen spies. So they had networks of informants in society, and it was someone reporting on their neighbor because they got jealous. I guess, or something about them making too much money. There's these cases too that I read that'll say, it's a factory worker who reports on his colleague, and they says the colleague showed up with brand new leather shoes, and he was wearing really nice pants, so I knew he was up to something, and he's like very frustrated that his colleague has so much nicer clothes than him. And so a lot of the cases get reported just like that. And then there are other cases where they get individuals who have been caught to flip on higher up actors, just like the DEA does in in fighting the Mexican drug cartels or something like that, right? So they capture people, interrogate them, and I have all of these interrogation transcripts, and then they get them to inform on other people, and then they'll launch big investigations. And these investigations could go on for months, sometimes years, because the activities were being carried out across the whole of China. So these individual officers had to travel around from place to place trying to gather evidence to carry out these prosecutions.
On kind of the research side, how did you get them to all the people you were interviewing and getting documents from to trust you and not assume that you were working with the government of China and kind of that side of it?
Yeah, good question. So how do I get people to trust me in this interviewing process? The first thing, I think it's really important if you can work through local networks. If I can find one of my friends who happens to know a higher up person in the local government of this place, and then have that person introduce me to other people, it instantly helps establish trust and credibility. It shows, hey, look, I'm on the inside. I'm not going to say anything that's going to get you in trouble, that kind of thing. I also tell them immediately, look, all of this is anonymous. I'm never going to put your name on any of this kind of stuff. That's really important. But most importantly, I think it's just you go and you meet people, and you're just very straightforward with them. You go out to dinner. Don't just do formal interviews. Have in China, banqueting is a really big deal, and they last for 3 hours. It gives a lot of opportunity to engage with people over longer periods of time and gradually build up trust. So I think those things all help. And then it just helps being locally situated. Go and spend time in a particular village for a month, and you just meet all kinds of people, and then they start to trust you over time. So all of these kind of techniques are things that I use to carry out the interviews. Anyone on this side? Okay, yeah, sure.
Did the central government ever crack down on local officials and prosecute them, and if not?
Yeah, no, they did all the time. They repeatedly did. So the Cultural Revolution, when it was launched, was sort of partly born of that exact impulse. They said, people under, kind of Mao had this radical faction in the party, and they basically argued that members of the party within the state bureaucracy had become corrupted. And they called them capitalist roaders, people that walked the capitalist road. And they called them the walking dogs of capitalism, Zogo. I don't know why that's a bad thing, but anyway, walking dogs of capitalism. And so the Cultural Revolution was actually born of this idea that the revolution had to be made against the state itself. And so that's also what makes Maoist era very, very particular and interesting, versus the Soviet Union or something. Mao wanted society to be in this state of perpetual revolution, because he argued if the state became overly bureaucratized, then inevitably you would get lots of corrupt officials and things. So you had to constantly make revolution against them. So anyway, they do this all the time. They carry out these things called mass campaigns, and every year or two they carry out a new one and purge a new number of officials. The problem is, no matter how much they kept purging people, it kept happening. The new, more radical and politically correct, ideologically correct individuals that they put to replace the displaced cadres, they were doing the same kinds of things. And so this just kept popping up, and it got bigger and bigger, and they just, by the middle of the Cultural Revolution, the central government, in their documents, they argue that they felt like they were losing control over the economy, that the local forces had taken over and were pushing it in a direction that was entirely out of their hands.
How long did it take for you to actually accumulate all this data and able to process it and analyze it on a micro and a macro scale?
forever, like 7, 8 years, something like that. I began working on this as a master's student, and then I did it throughout my entire PhD, and my PhD was a 7-year program. So long time. It takes a long time to do this. I suggest, when you guys are doing your research, start out maybe with case studies, start out with individual, because they're also really revealing. In fact, I don't even think it's useful beginning at the top, beginning with like very high level macro analysis, because especially when you're working with historical data sets, but even when you're working with contemporary data sets, it's very difficult to ascertain what exactly that data means. How is it constructed? Who put it together? What criterion did they use that said this count or doesn't count, right? All of these things are very difficult to unpack, and it's only through delving in really deep, like in my case, looking at these individual cases, that we begin to get a sense of what the data actually means, how it can be interpreted. Because if someone were to take the data set that I created and had not spent the time going through the kind of nitty-gritty micro-level case, they would come to probably, I think there's a lot of opportunities for misinterpretation about what it actually means. And how, because what you'll find, and this is true of historical actors and of present actors, people will say one thing, but they mean something quite different when you actually delve into how the data was constructed. So anyway, it takes a long time. I recommend starting, going deep first, getting a sense of what each piece of data means, and then trying to expand the view to more macro.
When you were collecting this data, did you ever get in trouble, like with the local government, or just the government itself? Like when they found out you were having like all these documents that were supposed to be destroyed, or like someone snitched on you?
Yeah, no. Good question. Yeah, so did I ever get in trouble collecting these documents? No, and so technically it's not illegal. A lot of academics in China also buy these kind of documents. There's also academic institutions, both in China and the US. So Stanford University, for example, has purchased a lot of these documents in the same way that I have. One does have to be, the thing is in China, if something is politically sensitive, irrespective of whether or not it's legal, you might end up in a little bit of trouble.
Okay.
So I do have to be careful. I also don't take these documents out of China. I work with them in China, I digitize them and read them and things. And then I also don't disseminate them, so I am careful with how I treat the sources. But that being said, no, I haven't gotten in trouble, and I hopefully expect that.
Do they approve, like the government, do they approve of you like sending them to Stanford, or like Stanford?
No. All of this stuff is done on an individual basis. It's individual scholars going out and collecting these sources. So yeah, the way, and this is something I think that is indicative of a more universal thing. The way that research works in different contexts is very different. Doing research in China is not like doing research in Germany, in a very kind of legalistic society, very rule-oriented, where you have formal procedures that you can go through. If you tried to do that for everything in China, you wouldn't get very far. You have to operate through local connections. You have to, now not to say you shouldn't be breaking the rules, but at the same time, the rules aren't very clear in many cases. They're rather vague. And so the mode in which you have to do research is quite different. And I think you would find the same if you did research in India, if you did research in Turkey or something. The way that you have to do research is going to be very culturally and contextually specific. Any other questions?
Were there, throughout all your research, did you find any big roadblocks that you came into that really made you take a step back and question your argument that the data really conflicted with your previous data?
Yeah, so I think so this project faced, roadblocks. So, okay, first of all, I would say this. Whenever you're doing detailed research, particularly of a historical nature, but not necessarily, you're going to find 1,000 counterexamples, individual counterexamples to whatever point you're trying to make. So it becomes a process of sense-making. You have to kind of navigate the sources. You have to read lots of different cases and start to figure out what patterns are there. And then you can also do this quantitatively. You can build up data sets and start to see if patterns emerge. But individually, the cases will say all different kinds of things. And so it's very, very difficult. If you were just reading one case, you would not get at the underlying trends and patterns of behavior. The second thing I would say is that these are documents of propaganda. Right? These are written by low-level government officials to their superiors to say, look, what a great job we're doing about prosecuting private entrepreneurial activity at the local level. They are intrinsically biased. And so the challenge then becomes, how do we make sense of these, and how do we find telling admissions? What are people leaving out? What are people admitting to that they maybe don't even mean to admit to? When we look at things, that was one of the things that I found really surprising, I guess. They were all saying they were prosecuting illicit economic activity to the full extent of the law, the regulations at the time. But then when you start analyzing it quantitatively at a macro level, you find, actually, no, you're not. Like, you're letting all kinds of people go. And in fact, the punishments that you're meting out are very measured and calculated. You're punishing certain types of things and not punishing others. And of course, they don't say this. But the patterns emerge when you look at enough cases and when you start to analyze them in different ways. So that's the challenge. They're saying one thing. They're saying we were being good, Maoist leaders were taking Mao Zedong, it's called Marxist-Leninist Mao Zedong thought, and we're applying that in the local context, and we're carrying out revolution. This is what they're saying, and every document starts like that. But then you're trying to tease out these hidden narratives that exist within the document. So yeah, it's difficult, and it takes time. But it's all about familiarizing yourself with the sources that you're working with and looking at many, many sources to start to detect patterns. Yeah? Yeah, so she was asking, were there quotas for prosecution? Yeah, there absolutely were. And you'll see, I don't find it in my data set that much in these two counties, but there are internal government documents, not that I found, but that other scholars found, where Mao Zedong will explicitly say 5% of the population needs to be prosecuted as landlords, as counter-revolutionaries, as speculators and profiteers, at least. So he will set a bar. And then it's like, okay, there are speculators, now you go find them. That kind of mentality. That definitely happens. But now what's interesting though, like I said, even if, so we see a couple really interesting things in the data set. One is that some of the cases will involve trivial amounts of things. They'll arrest someone who is literally selling one chicken or something in a market, and then call them a speculator and profiteer. Now that helps them fulfill their speculator and profiteer quota. Now it's very unfortunate for that individual who is only selling one chicken, that they're being lumped together with someone who started a big underground enterprise and things like that. So you do see evidence of that occurring. But then on the other side of the coin, you see a lot of people being prosecuted, and then the local government can say, look, we prosecuted these individuals, but then when you look at the actual punishments, they were negligible. They didn't punish them at all sometimes. They said, oh, we taught this person a lesson, and we re-educated them, and then we released them. And so there are all kinds of things. So what you see is this dynamic interplay between the central government and between local governments. All of these kind of principal agent problems, all of the local government actors who are exercising their own discretion and their agency to carry out things how they want to at the local level, whether or not it accords with central directives. I think we have time for one or two more questions if you have any.